Wesley Wright from the Psalm Association. Wesley has spoken at events like this before and is deeply interested in the local sort of contribution to the First World War. And we have Dr. Farrell McCluskey, who has written extensively about Tyrone and the 1916 Rising. In fact, his is the most recent book and detailed book about the events of the Rising in Tyrone. And I suppose we're still in the decade of centenaries. For the last 4 or 5 weeks, we have been looking at different aspects, myself and the other speakers and others as well, at different aspects of the period 1917 to 22. But feel free this evening to field questions from the whole period, really, from the Ulster Crisis, the rise of the UVF, the Irish Volunteers, the Great War, right through to partition, and the inception of 2 Irish states in 1921-22, because that's the way things are going. And I suppose just focusing on the local, because all history is local, and I know the speakers on either side will bring in local events as well. I mean, we talked about the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone, became a phrase that passed into the memoirs of Lloyd George and Asquith, because these were the pivot counties around which the whole partition debate, or the Home Rule debate, if you like, turned after 1912, with narrow nationalist majorities. The nationalist hope was they would be included in the Home Rule pale, with other areas of Ulster, which were nationalist by majority. The Ulster Unionists initially asked for the clean cut of 9 counties, but Carson, who had hoped to block Home Rule by using Ulster as a weapon, in the end sought the best deal for his northern clients. And in the end, they settled on 6 counties, which became almost an immutable demand by unionism in 1914 and 1916. And the whole thing almost settled after the Rising, when nationalists and unionists voted at separate conferences in Belfast for the exclusion of 6 counties. Nationalists like Redmond believed it would be temporary, unionists had guarantees it would be permanent, but then the whole thing collapses because of opposition from the southern unionists, who are sure-footed in the corridors of power. The effects of the Rising are working their way through nationalism. Nationalism in Tyrone, as the Right Ulster, is split on the question of partition. Redmondism is losing support in counties like Tyrone after the summer of 1916. At the same time, the Great War continues. Young men of Carson's army, Redmond's army, are still dying on the Western Front. 1916 is the Somme. 1917, we'll see, of course, the Battle of Messines, 7th of June, onwards from 1917. Which will involve men of the Ulster and the Irish Division. The press is chock-a-block with reports of the deaths of young men on the Western Front. In Omagh, for example, in 1917, the political correspondents of both the Ulster Herald and the Tyrone Constitution are both killed at the Western Front. And this is reported in the press. But Irish politics are in a state of flux. And nationalism, particularly young nationalism, is beginning to move away from Redmond's mantra. And in Tyrone in 1918, of course, you have the East Tyrone by-election. There's a party truce between Carson and Redmond, so the Unionists don't contest the seat. And the Home Rule candidate, T.J.S. Harbison, a solicitor from Cookstown, holds the seat against Sinn Féin's second challenge in Ulster. Sinn Féin's defeated Countess Markievicz outside. Is famously stoned in the Market Square as she speaks in March 1918 in defence of Sinn Féin, and as the stones bounce off her break, she shouts, "I care as little for these stones as I cared for the bullets of Easter week," and she has that very public school accent. Popular politics continues. The events of 1918, the Conscription Crisis, the great push on the Western Front. America has already entered the war. And then, of course, the rise of Sinn Féin throughout Ireland. Carson now demanding very much the clean cut for the 6 counties. The war ends, and we have the general election that defines the future of Ireland. The Sinn Féin landslide over nationalist Ireland, the emergence of a unionist majority of seats, particularly urban seats. Belfast and other towns, cities in Britain are given more seats than they had before the war. So Belfast goes from 4 seats to 10, which gives Unionism 9 seats in the city of Belfast. So there's been a shift in the balance of power from nationalists propping up a Liberal government to now Ulster Unionists as part of a Tory-dominated coalition. And it's that coalition that decides the details of the partition of Ireland between 1919 and 1922. So a lot of history in this period. So I'll call on Dr. McCluskey. First of all, he's going to give us maybe some slides, I'm not sure. But
yeah.
Yes, so Dr. Fergal McCluskey.
So I'm actually going to do it kind of in reverse. I want to internationalise the thing very quickly and then draw it back into the local. And the quote above you, "must be a movement of human liberation all over the world over," is actually from Roger Casement, who himself was executed after the 1916 Rising and viewed republicanism very much within an international context and within the context of the British Empire, an empire that he understood very well and that he actually turned his back on, which explains his involvement in 1916. The reason why I want to do this here is because in the decade of commemorations, it's very important not to lose sight of two of the principal themes of the period. One of the principal themes of the period is the idea of self-determination, that each nation had the right to determine its own destiny, and the concept of empire. And I'm going to talk very, very quickly about these two things within the global and then Irish context. And the reason why I've put Mahatma Gandhi on the screen is to talk in terms of Gandhi described himself as the greatest recruiter in Imperial India. He walked the length and breadth of the country recruiting Indians into the British Army on the understanding that India would gain self-determination or some form of self-government after the war. Now this very clearly isn't the case, and this leads Gandhi to reject compromise very much in the Simla and the Round Table conferences, and he spends the rest of his life really fighting against British imperialism. But it also talks about the need to address imperialism head on in terms of this commemoration. He says, "Never apologise for being correct or for being years ahead of your time." And the idea that at the high point of high imperialism, to challenge imperialism, was very much ahead of his time. And the most radical element within the Sinn Féin revolution were very much anti-imperial. But to understand this idea, what we need to try and think about is the fact that although the British Empire in the Paris Peace Conferences implemented the concept of self-determination across most of Eastern Europe in the defeated empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary and parts of the previous Russian Empire, the British Empire itself actually grew as a result, and the French Empire grew as a result of this. So these ideas that the war was about the defence of small nations, little Catholic Belgium, and concepts about self-determination, particularly after American entry into the war and the Wilsonian 14 points, that the post-war dispensation was based on the international concept of self-determination, but it was very much directed against the losers in the war, not the victors in the war. And the concept of self-determination was not applied in Ireland, despite the fact that there was clearly a mandate for Irish self-determination in December 1918. This demonstrates the seats that Éamon was talking about there. So 73 out of 105. You could suggest that these blue constitutional nationalists, with the exception of South Down, obviously, but there was a Logue Pact here, and one of the conditions for the Logue Pact was that you agreed with Sinn Féin's representation at the peace conference and you accepted the principle of self-determination. So TJ Harbison, who wins the by-election, directly challenging Sinn Féin because of the sea change in nationalist opinion between the beginning of 1918 and the end of 1918, and particularly in terms of the effect of the Conscription Crisis. Harbison has to sign up to the concept of self-determination. Now, so who do I mean by Republicans and anti-imperialists? I clearly don't mean every single Republican is an anti-imperialist. What I'm talking about here is perhaps the most radical edge of the Republican movement. So these are the people who were engaged in Republican politics prior to the 1916 Rising and who viewed Ireland's struggle for freedom as a struggle against a global imperial system, and who found common cause not so much with the white colonies, Canada and Australia, which was very much within the rhetoric of constitutional nationalism of this period, but sought to find common cause with the non-white nations of the empire, particularly India and Egypt. So this is a passage from Irish Freedom, the newspaper of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. It says, "The English Empire lives on the taxes wrung from the starving millions of India, and Ireland is asked to become a loyal partner, a loyal portion of the empire." Now, I'll not read through through it all, and I'm sure you all can read, but it finishes, he says, "There are other ways of obtaining freedom, and one of them is by joining hands with our Indian brothers, so that both they and we, may be stronger to fight against British tyranny." Now, this was very much a marginal and minority view in 1910, but because of the impact of the 1916 Rising, this becomes the rise of anti-imperialism within Sinn Féin takes on a far more fundamental and forthright character, and this can't be ignored. So what is this imperialism that we're talking about? When we're commemorating this period, we can't really have myopia about the nature of British imperialism and about the zeitgeist or the opinions of the time. Now, the best way to try and investigate or to articulate what this zeitgeist or this mindset is to perhaps to choose the words of the person voted as the greatest living Briton of all time. So Winston Churchill, as a member of the cabinet, was the Vice President of the International Eugenics Conference. He wrote to the Prime Minister Asquith, decrying the unnatural and increasingly rapid growth of the feeble-minded and insane classes, coupled as it is with the steady restriction among all the thrifty, energetic and superior stocks. And this constitutes a national and race danger which is impossible to exaggerate, and he recommended the forced sterilisation of insane people. He also, what was the nature of British imperialism? This is from a report of the British Cabinet just prior to the First World War. He said, "We the British are not a young people with innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory and are claimed to be left in an unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than it is to us." I'd say that's probably a fair enough comment. Now, this is not an aberration or a pre-war aberration. Churchill obviously continued to hold these views, even whenever he was fighting against European fascism, something that he needs to be lauded for. So in 1937, speaking about the Palestinian situation, he says, "I do not agree that a dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though we may have lain there for a very long time." So this is obviously an allusion to Palestine and the Palestinian people. "I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the red Indians of America and the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place," and that was to the Royal Commission on Palestine. And finally, to give you some sort of flavour of this, in 1943, during the Bengal famine in which 3 million people died, Churchill actually withheld food supplies and stockpiled food for the wartime struggle in Greece and Yugoslavia. And he says that, "I hate the Indians," he told the Secretary of State for India, Leopold Emery. "They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault," he declared at a war cabinet meeting, "for breeding like rabbits." And that he also, when he received a telegram reporting the famine in India, he inquired whether or not Gandhi had died of starvation yet. So what we have to praise Churchill and people of his ilk for their fight in the face of German fascism, but we cannot ignore that this was a period of high imperialism. Concepts of eugenics and racism were not restricted to the Germans by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I'm quickly going to finish because I know that we're cut for time. So what's the logical extension of this? The logical extension of this, obviously, is that there was a vote for self-determination in Ireland, and that the simplest way to resolve the Irish conflict was to implement the policy and the principle of self-determination that you'd implemented at the expense of Germany in your own territory. Obviously, no one's naive enough to suggest that great imperial powers reduce their own scope. But the second question, and I will finish this very quickly, is that there is now at the minute an idea that the partition of Ireland and this period were based on the idea that there were two nations in Ireland, and the fact that there are binary claims to self-determination. A lot of the research and the work that I've done has assessed whether or not this was actually the opinion of the Ulster Unionists who called for self-determination, and in fact really it wasn't. The Ulster Unionists stood on the same platform as Churchill stood on. Now, other members of the cabinet, such as Lloyd George, cynically used the ideas about self-determination and the two nations theory, which came from Lou Strachey, the editor of The Spectator, as a political device. But the Ulster Unionist campaign was very, very firmly based on principles of the British Empire and imperialism. And at the stretch, really, you could talk about the Ulster Unionists representing themselves as part of a wider imperial family which would have guarded against their insertion into an Irish Republic. So what are the characteristics of this? Well, this is a quote from the Unionist MP for South Tyrone, Andrew Horner, and perhaps it will echo some of what Churchill had to say. He told his audience in Fintona, the only sentence he knew in Ireland was the ascendancy of industry over sloth, of intelligence over ignorance, and of thriftlessness over thriftlessness. And no Act of Parliament could change those characteristics of the race that inhabited this island. He then told Parliament, again not mentioning much about self-determination, he says, do you think the men who are of our blood and race, controlling as they do the greatest interests of our colonies, will stand by and see you coerce us, your oldest colony, by force to leave the shelter of the Imperial Parliament and accept the government of men whose whole careers have been abuse and hatred of us and you? And then within private collections, when they're writing privately, they categorically reject this idea about self-determination for Ulster. Hugh de Fanberg Montgomery, clearly the most significant Ulster Unionist politician of the period, wrote that we may be grateful to the Spectator, this is the political magazine that hasn't really changed its political outlook in the intervening period, for urging that Ulster has a good right to self-determination as the rest of Ireland, but I hope the meeting tomorrow, and this is a meeting of the Ulster Unionist Council to debate partition, but I hope the meeting tomorrow will take firmer ground as loyal subjects and denizens of the British Empire, namely that no nation, belligerent or neutral, will allow the principle of self-determination to be applied where it means handing over a portion of the bulwarks of the realm to the friends of the enemy. So this is very much in tune with Churchillian policy, and this is the idea that self-determination is something to be implemented outside the British Empire, but not to be implemented within the British Empire. And the final slide, I'm sure you'll be glad to hear, comes from Joseph Fisher, who was the Unionist representative in the Boundary Commission. And again, in 1918, when partition is in the bidding, and when the Ulster Unionist Council are essentially coming to a position where they're going to accept partition, it happens later, it happens in 1920 formally. But he says, I'm trying to suggest to him that too much should not be made of self-determination, that it was not only adopted, or that it was only adopted or accepted by us as a second line of defence. In the old days it was simply used as a reductio ad absurdum when you reduced the argument to the most absurd level. Recently, it has come into the field of practical politics as an alternative to civil war and disaster. We have never asked for it or accepted it for its own sake. So the two principal points here is that a lot of the talk about commemoration of this period is blind towards Britain's role as the preeminent global power in the world. And a lot of the understanding that is based on the Sinn Féin mandate in 1918 and the way that the Irish Revolution unfolded tends to present British involvement in Ireland as that of a neutral arbiter, as a kind of referee between two warring tribes, when in fact Britain had very, very substantial and specific vested interests in making sure that the outcome of the Irish Revolution suited its own wider and imperial ends. And if we look and investigate the concept of self-determination and the outworkings of it in terms of partition, then I believe that a far clearer picture of what happens, particularly from 1918 until 1925, emerges. Thank you, Fanberg Montgomery.
Yeah, I thought he died about 1918, so this is about that time. Thank you very much indeed. And that brings us to Wesley, who's going to give us his take on the period.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not quite as eloquent as my two men gentlemen were there, so you'll have to bear with me when I have a little piece prepared. Just to introduce myself, I'm Wesley Wright, chairman of the Friends of the Song at Ulster, based in Cookstown, this past 15 or 16 years, and we exist, as our mission statement states, to remember the men and women from Ireland, and especially from Ulster. Myself, I was born close to the village of Luke between Marfelt and Coch, but moved to the town of Larne many years ago. But I keep close to all my relations in the Ballariffe area, as my mother, brother and uncles and aunts still live there. And my wife comes from Cookstown, hence my involvement with Friends of the Song, so I'm a real Mid-Ulster man. We as a group have had more than 25 pilgrimages to the battlefields, with as many as 56 people from across the religious divide, and upwards of 1,200 people have travelled with us. Tonight I'm going to talk about the Commonwealth War Graves, which celebrates its 100th anniversary today. Previously called the Imperial War Graves, formed by Sir Fabian Ware, and about the dead from World War I and especially from Tyrone. 1 Corinthians 15:1 The number of men who died in World War I is immense, and it's the credit of Fabian Weir that we have an opportunity today to visit our relatives' graves, and everybody never found then they are an appropriate memorial. World War I began on August 14 and Britain dispatched the VAF to France. Fabian Weir, already 45 years old, working for the Rio Tinto Mining Company and a very successful career in South Africa. Too old to join up, he joined the mobile unit of the Red Cross and arrived in France as its chief. They began searching for dead, and their burial location was the initial intention of helping the Red Cross tracing the missing. Fair was able to persuade the War Office to change its title to grave registration. This had been carried out before, but in a limited way during the battles of Waterloo, Crimea and Boer War. By early 15, they had 27,000 names on the registration, so they decided to leave the Red Cross and become part of the War Office. By April 15, it was established that equal equality of treatment and no repatriation. Some men were brought home during the early part of the war. Fair also negotiated with the French for the provision of land for cemeteries. He also had the foresight to see that they would need an official body would be needed to look after the graves. Men from all over the empire, as it was in those days, Canadians, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Newfoundlanders, were dying not only in France but Belgium, Macedonia, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia and Africa. By now he moved back to London with a staff of 700 and his rank was temporary Lieutenant Colonel and Director General. One of his biggest concerns was so many graves were marked unknown. Next of kin would have no place to remember their loved ones. He quickly established double identity discs made of compressed fibre which continued to be used during World War II. Even if there was no name for them, remains a single headstone was established which today states unknown soldier known unto God. By 1918 the name had changed to Pre-War Graves Commission and the number of dead was horrendously high. Over 1 million from Britain and the Empire, approximately half of them have no known grave. If the dead were able to march past this building tonight, 4 abreast, it would take 3.5 days. The cemeteries initially started by the army began when the war was over, and memorials to the missing would take much longer. From the date of the war ending on the 11th of November 1918 to September 1921, over 2,000 bodies were found, and up to 1937, 38,000 more had been found. Even up to early 80s, 20 and 30 a week were still being found. Today, those sort of numbers are found annually. Only last Tuesday, a member of the Yorkshire Regiment was buried. He died in late 16 and identified by DNA. Many of the staff employed by the Commission are ex-soldiers, as many wanted to look after graves, comrades' graves, and many of them married local ladies. And today, if you spoke to them in the cemeteries, quite often they'll say, my grandfather came out here, or my great-grandfather. The formation of the Graves Commission, now known as the Commonwealth Graves Commission, has drawn all the Allies countries together and employs about 2,000 people. The scale of the work is immense. 1,000 cemeteries, 1,000 crosses of sacrifice, 650,000 headstones and 85 large memorials to the missing worldwide in World War I. It is responsible for maintaining the cemeteries and the memorials to 1.75 million men and women in 140 countries around the world. This work was completed in 1938, just in time for another world war to start. It was an amazing task, arguably the biggest single bit of work since the Pharaohs constructed all their, and they never left their own land. In France, 20 memorials to the missing bear the names of 220,000 men, representing 40% of the dead there. In Belgium, the memorials to the missing bear the names of 102,000, half of the dead there. Many of people who are familiar to many, even to those who have never been, faithful to the missing in the Somme, 72,000 names. Many men in Gate and Ypres, where the dead are remembered every night of the year by the buglers of the Ypres Fire Service, has something like 54,000 names. And Vimy Ridge, where the Canadians are commemorated, to name but a few. The cost is borne by participating governments in proportion of the graves. Britain pays 81%, Canada 7%, Australia 6%, and so on. Actually, a man from this town is the director of the horticulture with the Commonwealth War Graves, David Richardson, and he created the first cemetery, which was created since World War II in 2012, the cemetery known as Francis Pheasant Wood. He's one of the very fussy guy because he insists that everything in the cemeteries must be pristine, since you as a relative may be making a one and only visit to their loved ones. Those who joined the American Army, immigrants from Tyrone, if they lost their life, the American government gave the parents or next of kin the option for their sons to be repatriated. Approximately 60% of them were repatriated. Thomas Doris, the one I'm using an example, interred in the Old Cross of Arboe, was one of 61 men disinterred and returned to Ireland on the SS Millwater. 6 other men were on that ship from Tyrone. By the way, no American man or woman lie in German soil. Even today, the American Battlefields Commission spends around $100 million per year searching for their missing from World War I to Vietnam. I have established that today roughly 1,740 men from this county lost their lives in World War I, mostly young men of all religious persuasions. Some had previously served and were reservists, those who listened to Carson's call to the fight for the Empire, and many who had answered John Redmond's call from Woodenbridge to go and fight wherever the fire line extend. Plus Tom Kettle as MP for East Tyrone. He was Chief Recruiting Officer for Ulster and North Leinster. At least 10,000 men from Tyrone must have enlisted. From the area of Mid-Ulster Council area as it is today, about 1,400 men died during the war. One of our political leaders said recently we should remember our dead from conflict. We all should remember our young men from World War I who lie in graves from here in this country, Gallipoli, South Africa, Basra, France, Belgium, Egypt, Greece and Poland, Germany, and other places around the world. Can you imagine the grief it must have brought to the parents of those young fellows? In some cases, brothers lost their lives, children losing their fathers. And anybody who wants any details of those people who died in Mid-Ulster, and the Cookstown War dead, the Dungannon War dead, and the Murrayfountain War dead are all our responsibility, and they're all on the internet today. You look at them free. If there's mistakes in them, then you tell us, because there's lots of little pieces of biographies added to them. So thanks very much for listening. Thank you, folks.
So, ladies and gentlemen, two very different perspectives. Wesley looking at the impact of the war and the impact locally. It's just staggered to hear just 600, I think you said, young men from Tyrone you think died in the, was it 600?
No, 1,600.
1,600,
Yeah.
1,600. So 1,650, and if you consider that 1 man in 10 was killed, then clearly that reflects a higher figure going off. And Fergal looking at the whole background of imperialism, the empire, attitudes to empire, which helped to explain a lot about Britain's attitudes to the struggle for independence in terms of whether they would ever grant a republic in 1919 to 21, and what was the bottom line they were prepared to accept during that period, because imperialism is a very strong force obviously in the world, and 3 empires have just collapsed in Europe by 1918, 1919, and Europe has been redrawn and indeed partitioned at that time. So there's so many aspects to this, obviously. There's the local, there's the international, there's the tragedy of the Great War, so we're really open to your questions or points. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, now at the back.
1917, the Russian Revolution. Was there any Irish or local connection to that?
There was one I can tell you, and I'm sure others will add, but I mean, interesting figure. In 1914, a Russian revolutionary arrived in Belfast to take up a job as a teacher in the only Jewish school in the city, the Jaffa School in the Antrim Broad. And his name was Maximilian Litvinov. And he had been told to look up one James Connolly, who was a trade union organiser based in Belfast. And he met Connolly and a few people called McDevitt, who were very much involved in that kind of movement. And he taught for 3 years in the Jaffa School. And after the first Russian Revolution, the moderate revolution, he returned, and he became, of course, Stalin's foreign minister in the 1930s, famously dropped at the time of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So he certainly was a Russian revolutionary who was here during the First World War. There was a large Jewish community, particularly in Belfast, but scattered throughout Ireland, and cities like Dublin and Cork as well. A number of those were actually Russian radicals of one sort or another, you know, who had left places like Lithuania. Some of them were on the run from the Tsars, and they ended up in Ireland, but maybe others know other stories.
The other thing that I do know is that at the end of the First World War, the people volunteered and went to fight in Russia. There's people from all over Ireland involved there, and I know a gentleman from Larne who actually lost his life in the Second World War, won a distinguished conduct medal there. So there's more in him. They're nearly all 48th, 49th Royal Fusiliers, which are London people.
They're fighting on the Whites.
That's the Whites, yeah. They were dropped at Archangel. Archangel. They were sort of drafted, and there were so many ex-soldiers at the end of the First World War. Many of them, you know, obviously, their lives disrupted by the horrors of the Western Front. You know, they were wrecking British cities like Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow, and of course they were filtered into various forces, including the Black and Tans and the White forces in Russia, when this Allied force was dropped to the Baltic in the hope of saving the moderate revolution. But of course, in the end, they became part of a spreading Russian civil war.
There would have been no one really locally in terms of the Russian Revolution, but what clearly happened was that for an initial period from late 1917 to possibly early 1918, there seemed to be a period where people fed off the revolutionary enthusiasm created by the Russian Revolution, and there was an outbreak of militant trade unionism here in East Tyrone. This also factored itself in
Coal Island.
in Belfast as well. Now the 1918 dockers and engineers strike.
Yes.
And by the January 1920 local election, I think it was 12, wasn't it? 12 members of the city council. So the Labour vote, and the Labour vote was led by Conleyite socialists like Kyle and Dawson Gordon and these guys. There was actually Sam Kyle was topped the poll on the Shankill Road. So there were the same number. There were 6 Sinn Féin and 6 Nationalists, isn't that right, Éamon?
Yeah,
there were 12 Labour.
60-member council in Belfast in 1920. First election held under PR, you know, across Ireland generally, as a minority safeguard. And out of the 60 seats, Labour of one sort or another, some of them were Unionist Labour, the UULA, who were set up by Carson, Ulster Unionist Labour. Then you had people who called themselves Labour, but followed their own agenda. And then you had Conley socialists, as you say, like James Baird and others. And they won a third of the seats in Belfast. I mean, you know, Carson and Conservatives in Britain were very concerned at Red Clydeside and all, because people were looking for homes fit for heroes, and they weren't sure they were going to get them in the post-war slum. But I can think of one other connection between Tyrone and the Russian Revolution, and I think this man on my left will certainly know about this. Dr. Patrick Mccartney, who was a GP in Carrickmore, an IRB figure returned after the Rising, elected to the First Dáil for a southern seat. But Mccartney became envoy of the Irish Republic to Russia, and he actually was responsible for bringing the Russian crown jewels back to Ireland, and they ended up in a coffin in a Dublin bank, and were actually handed back to Stalin in the 30s. So a Tyrone man brought the Russian crown jewels to this island. So there you are. Anything else? Yes, sir. Sorry.
The 73 Sinn Féin members elected in 1980 taking their seats in Westminster. Why should it have any impact on the Government of Ireland bill before it became an act to come to Parliament?
The whole point that the policy of abstention, and arguably the policy of abstention was the weakest element of the Sinn Féin platform in 1918, because there was a very well rooted tradition of praise of the representation in Westminster. There was great reports, particularly in the Irish language and throughout the period, of people coming to houses and listening to the parliamentary debates, someone reading the newspaper out. There was Calgary papers, there's a brilliant account of it. This was highly problematic for Sinn Féin. I think what reduced the efficacy of attendance was the Conscription Crisis, when the Irish Parliamentary Party adopted their own temporary form of abstention. They walked out of Westminster because of conscription, and this added fuel to the Sinn Féin's argument, and perhaps the argument is still a bit current today, is that unless nationalists held the balance of power, nationalist representation didn't have the same effect. Now it would have some effect in terms of amending legislation and stuff like that there, and the big argument of Harbism was that it created an orange platform in the House of Commons, but the British parliamentary system in many respects represents an elected dictatorship, and if you, particularly after the Parliament Act, once you have to secure a majority, and the National Coalition had to secure a majority after 1918, they could have forced practically any legislation they wished through. That is not to say that, you know, the voices of the, is it six? Led by Joe Devlin, or TP there.
TP O'Connor.
Yeah, so didn't make a lot of noise, but in terms of actually reforming and amending legislation, you know, they were facing a bit of a juggernaut.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly take the view that had Sinn Féin, which was never going to happen because their whole policy from 1905 was predicated on abstention from what Griffith always called the Hall of the Conqueror, and setting up a council of 300 which became the Dáil in Dublin. And from 1917, if they won by-elections, their candidates, while still struggling for a name, eventually became Sinn Féin. Count Plunkett adumbrated the policy of abstentionism. That caused problems for Northern nationalists in counties like Tyrone and Fermanagh, because they had abandoned Redmond because he had, you know, had truck with partition, and now they suddenly found that the Alternative Party were not going to take their seats, and as they saw it, leave the Carsonites in control. And it took a long time to persuade people like Michael Lynch, who owned the Ulster Herald group of newspapers, and he dies now in 1917. But all of those people had broken with Redmondism and thought Sinn Féin would be much more forthright on partition. Verbally it was, but it was not prepared to break this ban on sitting in an alien parliament. Now the interesting thing is Churchill was very concerned that possibly Sinn Féin, for badness, might suddenly arrive over in the mailboat and take their seats on the 1st of January 1919 in this new parliament. A parliament described very aptly as a parliament of hard-faced men who'd done well out of the war, the arms manufacturers, you know, the people who had produced the Royal Navy. They were all sitting in parliament, part of that overall Tory majority, with Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, as Prime Minister. And Churchill said, now he always drank port too late and smoked too much, but he said he had a sleepless night before Parliament was about to be opened in state. And he actually, you know, you wake up believing your nightmare's true, and he actually got up with a very sore head and headed straight down to the House of Commons, went up to the Distinguished Visitors Gallery and scanned the Irish benches. And you know what he wrote? I rejoiced in the blessed abstentionism of Sinn Féin because they weren't there. And he noted that the biggest Irish party in the House of Commons were the Ulster Unionists, led by Craig and Carson. They now had 23 seats and 3 from the south. And of course they were part of the coalition. They had 3 junior positions, including James Craig in the government, and they were in a position to dictate the pace. Now, what would have happened if Sinn Féin had taken their seats? Or here's another scenario. Let's pretend that the Home Rule Party had continued to hold 30 seats, or 35 seats. It could have happened. They lost a lot by narrow majorities. Then they would have gone back to Westminster, despite, I think, the protest about conscription. And that certainly would have deferred a settlement of the Irish question, because what hamstrung the British government from 1914 facilitated a process whereby the British government could introduce a Partition Act for an area designated by the Ulster Unionists and make it happen, establish the kind of bring about the pre-established constitutional security of a new state called Northern Ireland, and then talk to the South. And after that it was, you'll have to talk to Craig. He's a democratically elected Prime Minister. That's what Lloyd George tells Michael Collins. You understand? So it would have made a difference to some extent. So the nationalists are totally divided after 1916. They're totally disempowered. Unionism is united around the idea of 6 counties. And this came up in various talks. That was the least worst option for the Unionists. Both the Belfast Chamber of Commerce, writing to Lloyd George in 1917, and the Presbyterian Church, in a statement in March 1917, both said that they really didn't want the partition of Ireland. In fact, the Presbyterian Church talked about the complementarity of the industrial north and the agricultural south. But they said, faced with the horrors that they saw of Home Rule, they would prefer to be excluded from this scheme. But it wasn't something they were crying out for. They were saying it was being forced on them by the demand for Irish independence in these years.
I think that's probably a wee bit of, I would say, looking at the Unionist position, particularly from the autumn of 1913, the irreducible minimum in the 6 counties of the plantation, even though he got his counties mixed up, that the trajectory was clearly for 6 counties as early as that period, and that while Sinn Féin's attendance at Westminster, now there was a precedent for this where there was what you would call a social revolutionary movement in Ireland during the Long War and sizable representation. Within those circumstances, perhaps Sinn Féin could have made a stronger case, or perhaps delayed the legislation. But it's very, very clear after Long's committee, and Long's committee's recommendation of the 9 counties is White was told we don't want 9 counties, we want 6 counties. And it's particularly after March 1920, when they jettisoned the 3 Covenant counties. There's a large controversy here in Tyrone about this. San Quentin Ricardo, who's actually an Englishman, stands up and says that you're essentially abandoning Farnham and the people in Cavan, and you're abandoning Covenanters in Donegal and in Monaghan, and this is a breach of the Covenant. And there's a great letter from Hugh Van Montgomery who says, you know, Ricardo forgets that he's an Englishman and somebody should sit in his head and tell him to be quiet, because the thing about it was, and this is particularly key with the formation of the Special Constabulary, which Ricardo then comes back on board in September 1920 with McClintock and Richardson here at Dungannon. The thing is, it says that if they want rule by Sinn Féiners, they have to give in their UVF guns, they have to wear a special uniform, and the special is going to be the mechanism by which Tyrone and Fermanagh are secured against inclusion. And it's a very, very, you can read it in the letters, Strong's letters to Montgomery, how they are pains of the fact that they're losing what they would call their brethren in the other 3 counties, but realpolitik has kicked in, and they want to try and create a state that is going to have a majority in perpetuity. Now, might be a chance that was a miscalculation, but it's a 100-year miscalculation, and it served them well. So that I think Éamon's right in the fact that Sinn Féin could have made some sort of an impact, but it would have derailed much of their criticism of the parliamentary party. Also, when Sinn Féin proposing this in March 1918 in particular, and the Operation Michael and the Ludendorff offensive are going on, Sinn Féin, it's not particularly clear who's going to win the war. And it comes very clear once the Germans fail to break through the lines, it becomes very clear that the British and the Americans and the French are going to win the war. But when Sinn Féin are talking about post-war peace conferences, even in 1916, they don't know who's going to win the war.
They haven't ruled out the idea of Germany winning the war.
You know what I mean? So under those circumstances, abstention and appealing to post-war peace conferences, which the 1916 leaders basically are trying to do, their heads in their beds. It's a hostage to fortune, and it doesn't pay off.
Do you want to come in?
The only thing I can say is that when I went to stay in digs, as they say, in Ireland way back in the early 60s, the people who owned the guest house, only 4 years came from East Donegal, and they were unionists, but they were still bitter. And the gentleman's still alive today, actually, 94, and Sam many times said to me, "You guys in the north sold us down the river." You know.
Well, the best story of that is the County Donegal Presbyterian minister who attended that last all-Ulster meeting of the Ulster Unionist Council, with Lord Farnham from Cavan, Michael Knight from Clones, Presbyterian clergy from the Lagan in East Donegal, in the Ulster Hall. And that was the final meeting when Carson, despite a rearguard action by the Cavan and Monaghan Unionists to preserve the unity of Ulster, they argued we have 80,000 loyalists in the 3 lost counties who could rally to the Union Jack, and they were voted down. Fred Crawford used the analogy of a boat which had only a ship which had sort of 900 people and only 6 lifeboats, and they couldn't afford to carry all 9. And a County Donegal Presbyterian minister went back home that evening, and he very famously tore up the personal covenant he had in a frame in his study. He took it out and he tore it up and then put it back up with a big tear down as a permanent reminder, a conversation piece for the next 50 years about how he was betrayed by the Belfast Unionists. And I do a lot of work in Monaghan and Cavan, in former Unionist areas, particularly Drum and County Monaghan, which I think is fair to say is the last Protestant village in the Republic of Ireland. It used to be St Johnston, but people have moved out from the maiden city and that's changed. But Drum, and I've spoken in the Protestant Hall there a number of times, and you find a community that for almost 100 years has kind of kept below the radar. You know, Protestants in County Monaghan were 25% in the 1911 census. They're 7% today, even though quite a lot of the land is still Protestant owned. And the Protestants of Drum will tell you they signed the covenant. Carson addressed them at New Bliss nearby. They joined the UVF, but they found themselves on the wrong side of the line. And it's only in the last, perhaps, couple of decades, ironically within the European community, that they had links across the border with all sorts of communities. But also they got a TD elected, Heather Humphreys. She's now a minister. She's in charge of the whole Decade of Centenaries. She's from Drum. And that has given a great shot in the arm to people who felt that, you know, they were somehow in the doldrums between the old Union and the independent Irish state. But that bitterness does certainly endure and is an issue. Do we have another question? Yes, sir.
Just make the point that, speaking as a Presbyterian, one of the reasons I think that Presbyterians, Protestants in general, adhere to the empire was the fear that, and it's a well-quoted phrase, home rule would mean Rome rule. And now, to what extent, if Sinn Féin gets its way and there's a referendum and they go for United Ireland, to what extent does that still hold? Is home rule still Rome rule?
See, I find with history, it's always using the past as a way to the present, no matter where we go. That's what history is. We can't help but see the analogies. So, is there any, would you like to respond to that? Would you like to respond?
I spoke there about the radical perspective and and Éamon's already mentioned them. Whenever county option was first breached in March 1914, which was basically counties could vote themselves out of home rule, James Connolly was living in Belfast, and he says that this would lead to a carnival of reaction on both sides of the border. And essentially what partition does is that it enshrined, if you want to use the word reactionary, or the most conservative elements within northern society gained the reins of power, and the most conservative elements within southern society gained the reins of power, particularly after the acceptance of the treaty and the Civil War. And it was, you could say, ironic that the position and the hegemony that the Catholic Church enjoyed over southern society was in part, if not primarily, because of the role they played in supporting what you could be called the counter-revolution in the south, and secured their position. So home rule did mean Rome rule. Home rule meant Rome rule. It also meant very clearly a type of orange rule here in the north. Now, is the 26 counties the same country it was 100 years ago? It was clearly not. It's clearly far more liberal, far more secular. It's predominantly urban now, and in terms of social policy, and particularly because of the economic development, the opening up of the Irish economy under Whittaker, and the expansion of the Irish economy is opening up to the global market, the European Union. It's become a far more secular and liberal society, and you know the scandals that were linked to the Catholic Church in particular, and they seem to be just cyclical scandals year after year. This has, I think, has fundamentally damaged the Catholic Church's hegemonic position in southern society, and it has now got to the point, with particularly among younger people in Southern Ireland, that there seems to be a clear aversion to Catholicism with a big C, and that type of Irish Catholic nationalism, I think, is essentially dissipating, and it's evaporating. It's because of a lot of reasons, because they did enjoy, McQuaid in particular enjoyed such a firm grip and the ear of ministers and such social and political influence, but it's also because of the changes within the socio-economic fabric of the South over the past 50 years, that the South is a far different country now than it was 100 years ago.
Well, the past is certainly a foreign country as regards the South. I mean, just consider two things. 2 years ago, the greatest Mardi Gras in modern Irish history was the celebration of same-sex marriage. I mean, people were taking to the streets and dancing. I mean, you could never have envisaged that in the 1950s.
Cavalera leading the Mardi Gras.
Second, the man who is most likely to be the Taoiseach is Leo Varadkar, an Indian surgeon, Indian parents, of a Hindu background, who's gay. And he is the number one man likely. And of course, if he is appointed. But let's look back to the period you were talking about. Because of course, in 1910 to 1912, the issue of Home Rule is Rome Rule was a major slogan of unionism. And in many ways, there was a lot of evidence of that to the ordinary rank and file Ulster Protestant, Irish Protestant, and there were Protestant communities, obviously in places like Bandon and County Cork. Because, of course, in 1908, the Ne Temere decree was promulgated by the Pope. Now, before 1908, a mixed marriage could be solemnised in any church, and people used to follow the thing called the Palatine Rule, which came from the German settlers from the Palatinate who settled in Limerick with names like Schweitzer and Guerin. They were Lutherans. If they married a Roman Catholic, they had a rule that the children would follow their father's faith, the boys would follow their father's faith and the girls would follow their mother's faith. And this was very common. People would have mixed religion inside their own family. But in 1908, Ne Temere changed that. It insisted that mixed marriages were solemnised in a Catholic church and that the Protestant partner undertook in writing to bring up the children in the Roman Catholic faith. And that was not applied to Germany, much too dangerous there. You have a Protestant North and a Catholic South could cause a problem, but it's applied in Ireland in 1908, just as Home Rule is becoming a burning issue. And it's applied to a famous case in Belfast called the McCann case. And Mr. McCann leaves his wife with 2 children who are never seen by her again, allegedly at the instigation of a priest. That becomes a major propaganda issue during Home Rule. And for many ordinary Protestants, this is what it's going to be like under Home Rule. Parnell had been brought down partly by the Catholic Church in the 1890s, a church he didn't belong to. So you have all of that. So in many ways, if we go back through Irish history, the one era of hope was the 1780s and 90s, that liberal period, the United Irishmen, not only talking about United Irishmen under the common name of Irishmen, but they also had a great slogan, to banish the memory of past dissensions. Think about that. It's not going to be in any slogan you read in your literature coming in your door in the next 2 weeks. I want to banish the memory of...
Brilliant one. Are we forever to walk on the fields that our ancestors drenched with blood? Or are we to look forward to a brighter future? So the concept that Tone and the Presbyterians in Belfast thought was that wasn't... they acknowledged the colonial nature of Irish history and the divisions within Irish society, but they viewed republicanism and concepts of the Enlightenment and reason as a means of transcending this.
And they were talking about French-style republicanism.
Yeah, and creating a civic nation. Like
and that ideal is still there, has never been achieved, regardless of how republicanism manifested itself. But the thing is this, from 1798, the Act of Union, the industrialisation of Ulster, the polarisation of the two communities, you have religious revivals on both sides in the 19th century. Nationalism becomes increasingly Catholic by the 1830s under O'Connell. Unionism is conceived by Henry Cook, who talks about uniting the two churches in the bands of a holy marriage, Presbyterianism and Episcopacy, against, as he sees it, the subversive forces of popery, nationalism and liberalism. And so you have these two movements. Now there are always Protestant Home Rulers. I mean, Jeremiah Jordan is the Protestant Home Rule MP for Fermanagh to 1911. Richard McGee, who has a factory in Lurgan, is the Protestant Presbyterian nationalist MP for Mid-Tyrone. He's also a founder of the National Union of Dock Labourers in Britain, a major labour figure, yet he's an Ulster Protestant and he's a Home Ruler. The Reverend J.B. Armour of Ballymoney. The thing is, they're not representative of the wider community, but there were people who said in 1912 they didn't fear Home Rule, they believed there would be fair play. But the evidence of the McCann case, instigated fears in the unionist community afterwards, and there's no doubt about that. But that Irish confessional Catholic state that emerges in the 20s, the Free State of Cosgrave and then De Valera's era and all of that, I mean, certainly in the last 30 years, we didn't realise it, but when the Pope's visit occurred in September 1979, it was the end of an era. It wasn't the beginning of a new era of renewal for Catholicism. It was the end of the old Catholic, conservative Ireland. We didn't see it at the time. So you're talking now not about, we've heard of it, and Finton's, Fergal's absolutely right, an Ireland that's changing, it's much more secular, but also there's huge numbers of people from outside Ireland, many of them who don't share the same religious ethos of the origins of the state as well. So, I mean, religion is less of a burning issue now in the South. It's a secular state. And economics are more important than nationalism.
Would it be fair to say, though, and I think that this idea about nationalism and religion is that the type of utilitarianism of O'Connell, this link and this necessity really to create a Catholic nation, that this has very much been the hallmarks of constitutional nationalism across the long 19th century. And that what Éamon was talking about in terms of the devotional revolution in the 19th century, and it was that in many respects within civilised society there was a struggle between a marginal republican voice, Fenianism and things like that there, which was secular and republican, and the predominant Catholic nationalist voice. And that if you understand that within civic society the majority of people in Ireland describe the type of Catholic nationalism, then the role of the Catholic Church as almost like a proxy state, an intermediary with the British state, becomes a lot clearer. And you can see how that in some respects what happens from about 1911, 1912 to 1916 is an attempt to try and re-articulate and renegotiate that there on a republican level, but what actually emerges doesn't bear this much resemblance to the ideals expressed in the proclamation of 1916. You know, well, God's mentioned quite a lot in 1916 proclamation, but it's everybody's God as opposed to, you know, a very Catholic God. And there was to understand that mass movement that rises out of 1916, the Republicans involved in 1916 were only a component of a far broader popular movement, and the elements within that there, Éamon has already alluded to, previous constitutional nationalists, that you're talking really about an umbrella movement, and it's the components of that and the forces within it that emerge as predominant, particularly after the signing of the treaty, which I think leads to the Catholic Church not only assuming a new role, but cementing the role that they already had prior to the Home Rule crisis.
So none to fear that.
Well,
it's as simple as this. I mean, it's changing.
It's a changing island generally. But the other thing is, of course, that idea of reconciliation between peoples in Ireland, the peoples of Ireland, if you like, has not been attempted to any great extent since the 18th century. I mean, that is the great thing. So that is something that has never really been achieved. Of course, attempts are made from time to time to achieve it in our own society, but many would say in our own society, even our own political system. And we have a structure from 1998, for the last 10 years, it's been functioning until fairly recently. But the protagonists in that system still cannot define sectarianism. I mean, we don't have a ministry of community relations because we have difficulty in defining it across the board. I think that's a problem. Yes, sir.
Following on from what you said, to what extent do you think it's an exaggeration to talk about an Irish rebellion? You know, putting it crudely, you've replaced Dublin Castle with the Magdalen laundries and tribunals. Do you know what I mean? And I mean, I think we're probably, it's more sort of secularized society now, but that's an evolution rather than a revolution. And a lot of the lectures that I've come to, and I've enjoyed every one of them, is talking about revolution. Do you know?
Well, I think I know Fergal's written about this more recently than me, but I mean, the Irish Revolution is a phrase we use to that period, 1912 to 1922. Some people would stretch it to 25. I mean, basically, we didn't realise, people at the time didn't realise, when Carson gave his blessing to the Ulster Volunteers in 1913, we didn't realise that was going to have a knock-on effect in nationalist Ireland. It called into existence the Irish Volunteers. Soon, Ireland was on the brink of civil war. It created opportunities for the very small group of revolutionaries, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And they were able to use a section of the Irish Volunteers for the 1916 Rising, which was to undermine the fairly moderate imperialistic Home Rule party, which supported the First World War, Redmond and Carson together. And that leads to the rise of a movement calling itself Sinn Féin, wanting an Irish Republic, eventually achieving something slightly short of it, a free state, and then we have a civil war. So there is a revolution in those years, but it's a political revolution. I mean, it's not, for example, the land question, the biggest revolution in Irish history was the transfer of the land from the landlords to the tenants, and that really was completed in 1903 by Wyndham's Land Act. After a huge campaign, the Land League in the south, the tenant right movement in the north, mobilising people, Protestant and Catholic, the tenant farmers, the land question was a burning issue in Ulster. James Craig, future Prime Minister, failed to get elected in North Fermanagh in 1903. He was defeated by a land reform candidate called James Mitchell, who got the votes of Catholic and Methodist farmers against the landlords. So it's really the land question. If that hadn't been resolved by a Tory government in 1903, the Irish Revolution could have been very different. It would have been seizing estates, it would have been, a pogrom against the landlords, something that didn't really happen. So it's a political revolution. And the church, very interestingly, as Fergal has said, the church which had largely backed Home Rule, but then in 1916, after the Rising, when the Home Rule Party felt it would have to make concessions on Ulster to get an Irish Parliament, Cardinal Logue of Armagh wrote to his suffragan bishops, there's a project, he said, to cut off Ulster except Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. The bishops must be very careful in case they go down as the destroyers of the country. So the bishops start getting wary of the Home Rule Party and its concessions. They eventually give their casting vote to Sinn Féin before 1918. And the Irish Revolution is something that they manage as soon as the treaty is signed, partition and all. Cardinal Logue and his bishops issue a statement saying, "This peace is God's gift." That is the 7th of December 1922. And the church uses the pulpits to support the treaty and to stop the revolution going any further. Now you're into a situation where the church has a privileged place, a shaping role in that society. You mentioned aspects of it, the church in terms of education, the model in laundries, censoring government policy, overthrowing the mother and child scheme in 1951, bringing down a government, most of whose ministers said they wouldn't oppose the church on an issue of public health. That was the Ireland we're talking about, undoubtedly.
Yeah, what I would add to that there, I think Éamon is pretty comprehensive there, is that look at the Irish Revolution in terms of Kevin O'Higgins famously says we were the most conservative revolutionaries to ever carry out a successful revolution. From Kevin O'Higgins' perspective, that was true, but there were an awful lot of people involved in the Irish Revolution who had far more radical perspective. And if you look at the Sinn Féin revolution as that popular front movement, the defining and the foundation documents of the Irish Revolution are the 1916 Proclamation, the Manifesto of the 1918 in action, the Declaration of the Free Nations of the World, and the Democratic Programme. The Democratic Programme, Harry Boland more or less adopted what the Labour leadership, Johnston O'Brien, gave him, and it's an incredibly radical political document. So there were elements within the Irish Revolution who were calling for significant social change. Éamon's completely right. It echoes James Connolly's famous quote, "You can hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle tomorrow, but unless you..." So that is essentially what happened. There was a transfer of political power, and a limited transfer of political power, which essentially reduced or made a lot of the social expectations of the revolution redundant. Now the history of the 26 counties after this is about the consolidation of a very conservative elite, and then the escape valve of continuing emigration, which negates the pressure for significant social change. So 2 million people leave Southern Ireland after a supposed revolution to make the place a better country. Okay, and there's a very, very famous anecdote about Potter O'Donnell, the famous Republican socialist, and he's talking to De Valera. Now, De Valera basically rode into power on the back of the land annuities campaign that Potter O'Donnell had actually offered to the IRA and had refused. And later on in life, De Valera imprisoned Potter O'Donnell, but he was talking to him on the phone, and O'Donnell was giving out, and O'Donnell says to him, "Dave, what are you going to do about this emigration?" And De Valera turned around to him and he says, "Oxford Potter, if you were in power, people would be leaving the country as well." And he says, "That's right enough, Dave, but it'll be different people would be leaving the country."
And of course, we can't overlook the fact that in the new Northern Ireland we had a similar situation, where Lord Londonderry's attempts in 1922-23 to set up a secular system of schools. Londonderry was very, very far-sighted in terms of education. He went back to the 1830s when the national schools were set up as non-denominational bodies, but the churches had imposed it and denominationalised the schools, and he said, no, No religion in the schools. State system of schools, religion's outside the school day. If people want to bring in a clergyman or a priest, no problem, after 3 o'clock. And of course he faced the opposition of the Protestant churches, the Orange Order. Concessions were made by Craigavon. He left Northern Ireland politics forever, and we ended up with a situation that, the Unionist government in Belfast had the year of the Orange Order and the Protestant churches, when Dev had the year of the Roman Catholic Church and Catholic solidarities,
And the Catholic Church also accepted, a limited subvention in order to have control of their own schools.
Sorry.
Who first formed the first UVF, and for what purpose? Were they connected to the government at any?
I don't know if Wesley wants to talk about Tyrone, maybe you would know a bit about Carson's army in detail. I suppose we could talk. The UVF really begins with a group of Tyrone, it all goes back to Tyrone, a group of Tyrone Orange men at Craigavon's house, called Craigavon. His father was a whiskey distiller, and he had a big house still standing. Can't sell it to anybody at the moment, on the shores of Belfast Lough, with a beautiful amphitheatre around it and a view of the loch. And in 1911, Carson, who had just signed up to become a Unionist leader, the Dublin lawyer who didn't know the North at all, and whose cousin had invented the name Sinn Féin, Milo de Butler, he arrived up, and Craig wanted to introduce him to the Unionists of Ulster. And they all formed up in March from the city centre on a September afternoon. And one group of about 100 Tyrone Orange men stood up and struck Carson because they were marching in military formation. Nobody else was. And that was the first sign of marching against Home Rule. And very quickly after the covenant was signed, it was decided to establish drilling groups sprung up in places like Baronscourt, the estates to friendly landowners, Orange Lodges, the shipyard, with dummy rifles, broom handlers mainly. And by January 1913, there were so many of these groups calling themselves volunteers, echoes of the 18th century, that it was decided to weld them together into a new force, and that became known as the Ulster Volunteer Force. Carson took responsibility. It had received guns from Germany big time in the spring of 1914. And of course, it was welcomed by leading nationalists, not the Home Rulers, people in the Gaelic Revival, people in the IRB. It was Owen MacNeill from Glenarm, who was a Gaelic revivalist, a professor of history, who wrote an article in the Gaelic League's Journal in November 1913. We had now 10 months of the UVF, and he praised Carson's army. He called his article "The North Began," and he was quoting the young Ireland poet, Protestant Trinity College graduate Thomas Davis, who wrote A Nation Once Again. And Davis had talked about the United Irishmen in Ulster, people like Henry John McCracken, a Presbyterian, and he said, "The North began, the North held on, God bless the Northern land." And MacNeill in his article said that Carson and his army had taken the most important step towards Irish independence since Wolfe Tone. Now that might sound daft, but what he meant was they were defying the British Parliament and daring the British Parliament to introduce Home Rule in Ireland, or they would fight it. And within days he was approached by IRB men, like Bulmer Hobson, a northern Quaker, who said, "Look, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and call a meeting and set up the Irish Volunteers?" And soon we had 2 armies. So that's the origins of the UVF. People joined it for a whole range of reasons. And summer weather like this, they wanted to wear nice uniforms and get the girls to look at them in the corners. If you read the reasons why they joined and ended up in the Western Front, sometimes it was just everybody else was joining, it was a bit of crack. And then, of course, the war came, and Carson committed his troops to the Western Front in Pal's divisions, and there they went from Ballygawley and Omagh and East Belfast, and suddenly you had the sacrifice of the Somme.
Yeah, but what the evidence for Tyrone suggests is that there's 2 things happening, particularly amongst the Orange men. There's independent drilling, and then there's a very quick recognition that the main leadership of unionism in the county, but particularly the big house unionists and the mill owners in Dungannon, then patronise this very, very quickly. So Ranfurly and Lord Northland joins the Orange Order and speaks from the platform at the 12th, and Baronscourt, the Duke of Abercorn, takes a leading role in it as well. Both Stevenson and Dixon and Dungannon and the 2 major mills in Cookstown actually give men paid leave to go and drill for drilling. So it's very much, it begins as an independent movement, particularly amongst more what you would call forceful elements within Orangeism, but it then becomes almost a communal thing because it's linked to employment and social status, and it's very much a top-down organisation. The thing about Orange, one of the key things about the Arms is to understand that the Arms were financed within Ireland, but were also financed from sources within the Tory establishment in Britain. So when Fred Crawford goes to Germany to buy guns in 1914, he receives a cheque from Walter Long on the floor of the House of Commons in the presence of Bonar Law, the leader of the opposition. So imagine if Jeremy Corbyn gives somebody a cheque to go to buy a load of guns on the the floor of the House of Commons today. You're getting a picture of the dramatis personae that are involved and the level of high politics that meeting with ordinary 5/8 and ordinary people in Tyrone and that whole spectrum of politics. The big thing about the Irish Volunteers is they do not have that support, that establishment support. Redmond and Devlin say there's no call for Irish Volunteers. This is all a bluff. The Unionists aren't sincere in this. There's never going to be a fight. We don't need a volunteer movement. But as Éamon says, this was an opportunity for people who were either disenfranchised or directly opposed to constitutional nationalism, and the gun being brought back into Irish politics, and the fact that the authorities didn't suppress the volunteers, give the opportunity, and then that leads to what Éamon's talking about in terms of the Rotunda Hall.
And the historian Michael Laffin put it very well. He said Carson had reignited the Fenian flame, the flame of that old revolutionary resistance. He didn't mean to, of course, it was unwitting. We have the novels of Brinsley McNamara, James Weldon, a teacher's son, way down in Delvin in County Westmeath, and he, in his great novel about this whole period called The Clanking of Chains, and he says that in the fairs and pubs of Westmeath in 1912-13, people were reading Carson's speeches in the local paper, and he at one stage talked histrionically about leading an army from Belfast to Cork to oppose Home Rule. And they were saying, these boys are coming down here from the Black North. Do you see that? Carson said. And he says in the novel, he said, Carson put flint into the soul of Irish nationalism. Soon everybody in County Westmeath, a sleepy county in the Midlands, connected with cattle, wanted to join an army of their own. And the Irish Volunteers began to grow, exponentially in response to Carson's army, bringing, of course, as they grew the country nearer and nearer to civil war in 1914, something that was averted probably by the outbreak of the Great War.
Yeah, and this is part of a wider European idea about youth, the vigour of youth and militarism, and this is happening, and these corps of young men are in the build-up to the First World War are proliferating across Europe, and this idea, this is it in an Irish context really, through the lens of the Home Rule crisis.
Yes, sir.
Who wrote that, or who was responsible for writing the 1916 proclamation? Was it on their own, or did they copy it from some other nation?
Yeah, I know Fergal had a lot to say about it. Just say very quickly about it. The amazing thing is it's exclusively in English, except for three words, Public na Héireann, the Irish Republic. Coming from a background of the Gaelic revival, when so much emphasis had been on the Irish language, the 1916 proclamation is 98%, 99% in English. That's the first thing about it. It's regarded as being the work of two men, Patrick Pearse and James Connolly. They are certainly the co-authors of the... Connolly, of course, Edinburgh Irishman, committed socialist, trade union organiser in Belfast, involved with the Irish Citizen Army. He was going to have his own socialist revolution when he was waylaid by the IRB and said, you're not going to spoil our party. And so he committed this tiny elite force of 200 ex-soldiers, ex-Irishmen in the British Army, into the Citizen Army. It plays a key role, particularly at St Stephen's Green, with Countess Markievicz involved. But Connolly, Pearse, of course, who had been a language revivalist, again the outside element. His father was an Englishman. His father was a sculptor, produced church kind of sculpture all over Ireland. The statue in St Patrick's Chapel in Donegal Street, often in the news, is by Pearse and Company of Dublin. And Pearse was brought up in this atmosphere, and of course he was prepared to accept Home Rule in 1912 as a step on the way to greater independence. He becomes radicalised quite late, 1913, 1914. He's writing about the old heart of the earth being warmed with the red wine on the battlefield, all of this kind of messianic rhetoric. He's brought into the IRB. Tom Clark from this town sees him as the perfect front man. Great orator, spontaneous orator. He does the O'Donovan Ross of humour. Give it to them hot, Tom Clark says in 1915, and he does. And he's the man, no military background. I mean, when the Rising breaks out, I've read the statement of Winifred Carney. Pierce is horrified when he sees the first casualties outside of the Rising. And Connolly says to his secretary, a Belfast girl, Winifred Carney, get that man a desk somewhere in the basement and we'll give him a job as the editor of War News. So at the last of the Rising, Pierce sees he's in the vaults as Connolly becomes the leader of the resistance. But they're the people who came up with it, and all those phrases, and cherishing the children equally is in the proclamation. But it's not to do with children. It was all the children of the nation. It talks about attempts by a foreign power to divide Irishmen along religious lines. They do address that issue, and they promise civil and religious liberty to all, and so on. I would say 20 people heard it read. If you have a copy today, it's worth at least €500,000.
Yeah, well, the primary author of the proclamation is Pierce, and Pierce based it in very many respects, the outlet, a lot of the message on Emmet's proclamation in 1803. Emmet was Pierce's hero.
Yes.
And Pierce lived in his...
He even has the alleged block where Emmet was beheaded in Pierce's school in Dublin. You can visit that free, by the way. It's a brilliant...
And Emmet used to visit Sarah Curran when it moved, when Scollana moved. And that idea about Emmet and sacrifice Christ and his perfection and stuff, and this messianic thing, it can be over, but it's clear that Pierce has a very romantic notion of the spilling of blood, and this again fits into this wider European cult of militarism and
blood sacrifice.
Yeah, and now the thing about it is then the input in terms of secure equal rights and the cherishing of the land of Ireland belongs to the people of Ireland is Connolly's input, and it's Connolly's influence really on Pierce over the latter period of the plan. And Connolly brought in February 1916 both him and Pierce then, and Pierce writes a brilliant series of things called the Common Revolution, and part of it focuses very specifically on this blood sacrifice, but there's also a lot about the sovereignty of the people and these increasingly left-wing and socialist ideas. So if you read the 1916 proclamation as Pierce's imagining really of what Emmet would have wrote under the influence or the left-wing influence of Connolly, it's also Éamon's point about Pierce being horrified by political violence actually fits in with Emmet. So when Emmet sees Lord Kilwarden killed in 1803, he calls off the Rising. So he just is talking about history going around in circles. So those are the two main writers, and it's clear that Pierce is the man who writes it, but that Connolly clearly had some sort of influence, particularly in terms of the...
But that's terribly important, because Pierce is declaring an Irish Republic in arms, in the sunshine, at Easter Sunday, as most people are going to the races or the seaside, including a lot of Northerners who are trapped in Dublin in various hotels, because it was the capital of Ireland. It's known as the Betram, but the very act of reading the proclamation of a republic means that, of course, ever afterwards, the republic was proclaimed in the view of Republicans on Easter Monday 1916. It was affirmed by the first Dáil in 1919, and that becomes the issue, of course, later on. That republic wasn't achieved, so later IRAs claim that they're defending the right to the first Dáil and the second Dáil and so on, all of that there. But that's the proclamation. Sorry, yes, Mark.
In 1912, the Unionist position was no home rule for Ireland, for all of Ireland to stay part of the United Kingdom. The Nationalist position was home rule for all of Ireland, but Ireland within the United Kingdom, which probably evolved by the 1920 to be, I think the Sinn Féin position would have been a republic for all of Ireland, separate from the United Kingdom. But if you take the initial positions, what we ended up with, was probably nowhere close to where both Unionists and Nationalists started out. So basically my question is, what mistakes did Unionists and Nationalists make that they ended up with a situation that was nowhere close to what they would have desired? Or was what we ended up with probably somewhere close to a compromise that may have been negotiated had circumstances been different?
Yeah, well, I think the point here in terms of the unionist position and the nationalist position is that you must understand the unionist position as a wider power play in terms of British politics. Edward Carson contemplated standing to be leader of the Conservative Party before he accepted the leadership of the Ulster Unionists. And Ulster was for the integrity of the United Kingdom and the integrity of Empire. The fight would be in Ulster, but it was not just about Ulster. It was about the very fate of Britain as an idea, because what essentially had happened was that after the collapse of Gladstone's ministry, the Liberals are in disarray. There's a consolidated period of Tory rule. The Liberals then come in, as the Liberals and the Whigs had previously done under Grey and stuff like that, on a reforming platform. And the reforming platform is talking about fundamental social reform and constitutional reform. And the Home Rule issue is really Randolph Churchill put it very well when Gladstone introduced Home Rule. He says, when the grand old man went for Home Rule, I decided to play the orange card. I hope it is the ace of trumps and not the deuce. Ulster is the Achilles heel of Liberal policy, because the Liberals are forced to come to terms with the Nationalists because of electoral arithmetic. And understand Carson's position, not just in an Irish context, understand Carson's position within a wider British framework, and understand Bonar Law's entrance into the fray, New Brunswick man, Ulster Presbyterian minister, as a father, as people who are emotionally tied to the Ulster Unionist cause, but at the level of realpolitik are employing Ulster in order to halt the programme of liberal reform and to gain and to acquire power. So if you're saying how did it work out, how Ireland worked out on one level was significant to these people, but on a far higher level wasn't as significant. What was important was that after the First World War, although Bonar Law doesn't engage in the National Coalition, the Tories are back in power, and F.E. Smith, who had opposed Home Rule as Lord Birkenhead, is one of the primary forces within Lloyd George's coalition, and the Liberal Party are destroyed.
Yeah, the first and last great Home Ruler was Gladstone himself. He's the man who said, my mission is to pacify Ireland. He brought in all the reforms, the land reforms, then he's converted to Home Rule, persuaded by, he says, the genius of Parnell, an Irish Protestant landowner. After Gladstone's failure twice to bring in Home Rule and his death, his successors are reluctant Home Rulers. People like Campbell Bannerman, a Scottish nobleman, had no interest in Home Rule. Lloyd George had no interest in Home Rule, though he had been a Welsh Home Ruler for a while. Asquith was a liberal imperialist. He wanted to build up the British Empire. Ireland was a distraction, but they were social reformers. The Tories were regarded as the stupid party. Winston Churchill crossed the floor in 1903. He said, I'm leaving the stupid party because I want a party involved with reform. Reform like old age pensions, reform like national health insurance, education acts. That's what the Liberals stood for. And they had a big agenda. And they were popular with the working classes. They were the party of the working class. They were popular with Scottish Presbyterianism. They were the main party in Scotland. And Home Rule was part of their agenda, like world peace. It wasn't something they expected to come round to any time soon. But events, dear boy, events in 1910 forced the Liberals to embrace Home Rule. They were in a hung parliament. They needed John Redmond's 80 votes. Redmond wanted all Ireland Home Rule. We better do something. But they were reluctant. And Asquith made it clear, advised by Lloyd George and Churchill, if the going gets rough, we'll go for a 4-county split or a 6-county split, and we'll tell the Nationalists we're sorry, but this is realpolitik. And that's really what happens in the end. The Nationalists are promised everything, and then they see their hopes diminish by 1914 and 1916. Now you're saying, was this the Ireland people dreamt of? Well, first of all, the man in the street, the woman in the street, in Dungannon or Cookstown in 1912 would have been amazed if you had said in 10 years' time you're going to have had a world war, a revolution, massive sectarian violence, the partition of Ireland, a parliament in Belfast. What? He would say Home Rule in Belfast? Yes, this is all going to happen in 10 years. He would say, catch yourself on, I'm going back to the farm. But that's what happens. But the one thing that is constant is the British establishment were determined to keep Ireland within the empire. That was vital. Ireland was seen by the Tories and the Liberals, but particularly the Tories, as the key to the British Empire. If you give Ireland independence, which that small, robustious group around the IRB are demanding, then you risk India, you risk Canada, you risk the new African colonies. And therefore, you must keep Ireland as a whole within the British Empire. Now, if you can keep Ireland together, that would be the kind of handiwork of the Act of Union. That would be very neat and tidy. But if you can't, if Irishmen can't agree, then you'll come up with the best deal you can. And of course, again, in that fluctuating political situation, the Tories' decision in 1886 to oppose Home Rule, Mr. Gladstone went to Lord Salisbury and said, listen, you and I know Ireland's going to have to be given self-government. The people are demanding. They've 85 out of the 100 seats. Why don't you bring it in? You're the Tory leader. You command the British establishment and I'll back you. Salisbury thought about it, but he realised he couldn't deliver the Tory party. He says, I'm sorry, I can't do this. So Gladstone ploughs the lonely furrow, and the Tories make Ireland the keystone of their policy. And under Bonar Law, a son of an Ulster Presbyterian minister, the whole thing is exaggerated. Bonar Law is a fanatical partisan of the Ulster question because he brings all his blood and tradition to it. And as the historian David Dutton, the historian of conservatism, said, in those critical years, 1912 to 14, by backing Ulster Unionist resistance to the very point of illegal German guns, the Tory party strained the very bonds of the British Constitution and bring the whole of these islands close to civil war. You'll notice no British Prime Minister ever mentions Bonar Law. You'll hear references to Disraeli, you'll hear references to Churchill when he was a Tory, Harold Macmillan, Thatcher. Nobody ever says Bonar Law, that guy who said there are things stronger than parliamentary majorities. Remember that guy? Nobody mentions that. Because this is a sort of an aberration in the history of the Tory party. But they still manage. They're the driving seat after 1915, the coalition, and certainly after 1918. They dominate Lord George. They're friends of the Unionists because they'd forged that alliance, the Orange Card in 1886. And they give the Ulster Unionists what they want. I mean, the thing raised by Fergus is very important. The Unionists were offered 9 counties in 1920. You can have a 9-county parliament. Isn't that what your covenant says? It was Craig who intervened. I don't want 9 counties. It would be ungovernable, he said. 9 counties. I mean, there's a 44% Catholic majority in 1920 in 9 counties. Kind of the same as today. Catholic. Minority. But Craig is not prepared to deal with that. He realised that would destabilise. He wants the largest working majority for the foreseeable future, and he goes for 6. So in many ways, independence, Home Rule to most people meant independence. I think if you ask people in nationalist Ireland, and as nationalism responds to the rising, the executions and the international demand for self-determination, what emerges finally is more than Redmond ever asked for 26 counties. But it's still within the British Empire. Both parts of Ireland remain in that empire until 1948.
Were there no, during the time that the partition was being discussed, like the 1912 right up to 1920 or whatever, were there no voices on the Unionist side that were arguing strongly for the 9-county Ulster, and even a soft border along with it? Trying to get the current. It seems to me, from a Unionist point of view, if I was an advisor at that time, that's what I would have been advising, because you know this idea of a hard 6-county where we have a definite majority. It's really it was a silly move, you know. What they should have done was kept a 9-county Ulster, a soft border, with the view to encouraging others to want to join this. I mean, the social aspects of the revolution that you know, it kind of fell away. And you spoke about 2 million people leaving the so-called Better Ireland, and it was arguably a lot worse for many decades. And for, you know, it seems to be a much more sensible unionist policy to be say, no, we will have a 9-county Ulster, and we want to encourage others to come here if they so wish. You know, you spoke about secular schools and so on. You know, where had the voices from 120 years previous, the United Irishmen, Presbyterians gone? Was there nobody of that view that instead of sort of a hard, you know, this is a Protestant state for Protestant people, and we're you know, that's how it's going to be? That was a silly thing to do. They should have said, no, this will be the shining beacon, and people will want to come back. And I think you know, I'm speaking from a unionist point of view. This is what would have been my advice to them. I think in a previous talk you mentioned about even in some parts of Dublin, right up maybe to the 60s, there were unionist
Just had a discussion with somebody coming in about that.
votes, you know, in Rathmines and so on, and Trinity College. So at that whole Peel area, there must have been a unionist voice there.
That's an interesting point. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, well, the people who would have been of a mind that you're talking about in terms of that sharing that Presbyterian position, they would have agreed with All Ireland Home Rule. J.B. Armour and people like that there, and Jack White and Casement and the meeting organised by Armour, I think it's September 1913. So the thing is about the creation of the 9-county, what do you want to call it, Northern Ireland or Ulster, alright, defeats the purpose of the formation of the 6 counties, if that makes sense, because the nationalists were prepared to offer safeguards for minority rights in Ireland within Home Rule. There was a lot of talk about safeguards during the drafting of their Home Rule. There probably wasn't enough attention on Ulster specifically at the beginning of the planning for the Home Rule. In fact, they spent an awful lot of time trying to get £3 million out of Ireland, and then they've set up the Promote Commission and stuff, when they'd probably been far better advised dealing specifically with Ulster. But it was a wait and see policy. They let Ulster, you know, knock themselves out. But that possibly would be what we're talking about in terms of the 9-county thing, was with the people, and particularly people, and there were some consolidated, or there was a liberal Protestant mentality in South Tyrone in particular, who previously would have been they voted William O'Brien in during the Land War, and then voted T.W. Russell in later on. These people would have just been liberal home rulers, and 9-county Ulster probably wouldn't have done much for them. The creation of the 6 counties was in and of itself the creation of, as you said, create very famously said, a Protestant Parliament for Protestant people. So that was the raison d'etre of it. Interestingly, Sinn Féin didn't do an awful lot to attract Protestant people from a working class position. So it's Forbes Patterson they appoint in 1918, 1920 to investigate the possibility of attracting working class Protestant support. And he tours Ulster and he looks at a large number of working class Protestant people who are involved in trade unionism, and he says what Sinn Féin need to do is desectarianise their message and to point to the democratic programme and the radical elements of the democratic programme. There's a constituency within ordinary people in Ulster, no matter what religion they have, who will be attracted by social reform and progressive policies. Sinn Féin refused to do this. In fact, Sinn Féin and John Mackay, who worked for the Folklore Commission, really attacked Sinn Féin, and he was a fervent Sinn Féiner, for the Logue Pact. He said the Logue Pact was a critical mistake, because what it did was it gave ammunition to the Unionists to say that Sinn Féin's the same as the Irish Nationalist Party. Sinn Féin are doing a deal with the Hibernians, and what difference is there really between Sinn Féin and the IPP when they're under the command, or when Logue's negotiating this? Another critical mistake, I would probably say, although it was a boon for them at the time, was the signing of the anti-conscription pledge outside the chapel. So this is the thing that, as I've said, Sinn Féin in and of itself would have had an awful lot of quite radical and secular Republicans within them, but there would have also been an awful lot of Catholic nationalism, and it's very, very hard to try and attract support for that type for independent Ireland if you reinforce a lot of the critique that Ulster Unionists would have used previously against constitutional nationalism.
Yeah, several aspects to that. First of all, of course, the 1798 experiment, you were saying, what happened to it? And it was still identifiable over large parts of the province of Ulster down to the 20th century. I'll give you a few examples. I mean, Armour of Ballymoney was a Presbyterian minister who watched an eviction as a small boy in the 1840s in the route outside Ballymoney, and he said that from that day he was determined. He saw the landlord of the Crowbar Brigade turning the man and his family out of the snow. And he said, from that day I was determined to drive a nail into the coffin of landlordism in Ireland. He became a Presbyterian minister in Ballymoney, brilliant orator. He wanted to become a lawyer. His father insisted he go off to the church. He became a land reformer, and he became the main voice of Home Rule at the Presbyterian General Assembly down to his death in the 1920s. Now, until 1910, Ballymoney, North Antrim, had a liberal pro-Home Rule MP. Even after that, the vote was very evenly divided. Many Presbyterians were Home Rulers. They held a meeting in Ballymoney Town Hall in October 1913, addressed by a totally Protestant battery of speakers, Roger Casement was just back from consular service, had no identification with nationalism. You had F.J. Bigger, the Belfast lawyer, and you had the son of the chairman of Harland and Wolff, Alec Wilson, and these people with armour were all talking with a Union Jack on the table about the benefits of a Home Rule Parliament for the whole of Ireland within the Empire. And in fact, it was so serious that the Unionist press were attacking Ballymoney, and there was an amazing tradition there. In North Down, Ernest Blythe, who was an IRB man but a Protestant from Lisburn, who became Deputy Prime Minister of the Irish Free State, who died in the 70s. Blythe, as a journalist in Newtownards, County Down, in 1915, said he discovered the existence of a thing called the Green Lodge of Greyba, the Green Lodge of Grey Abbey, which was a Fenian circle, exclusively Presbyterians and the descendants of the men of 1798, and he actually attended the funeral of one of these old boys, a Presbyterian from Grey Abbey, County Down, and he was known as Fenian Geordie. So there you are. So there were aspects of that lingering on in areas which had been touched by the 98 rebellion. But then you have other towns which had taken the side of the yeomanry, places like Bushmills, parts of Tyrone where the yeomanry was strong, and that spirit of 98 polarised people as well as uniting them. You said about Ulster and partition. Well, of course, the Covenant was for 9 counties, but increasingly, as the ground settled, it was very clear Unionists couldn't win seats in most of Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan after 1885 when the working man got the vote. The landlords certainly wanted to maintain a role in the whole province under the Union Jack, but they were increasingly being marginalised by 1916. The pragmatists were at work. The Fred Crawfords, he was the gun runner. They wanted a homeland that would be safe. Craig was very much in that camp. And that led, of course, to the pushing for 6 counties rather than 9, and the rejection of 6 counties. Now, you say, why did the Unionists not go for a soft border? Well, of course, there could have been a soft border in 1916 when Redmond and the Nationalists and Carson and the Ulster Unionists agreed to 6 county exclusion. There would be no Parliament in Belfast. That was one up for the Nationalists. But there would be no Dublin Rule. That was one up for the Unionists. You would have a very soft border. 26 counties would have control of education and agriculture and a few other things. The British Army would still recruit in Ireland. The RIC would still be the All-Ireland Police Force. You would move from Tyrone into Monaghan, like crossing from Armagh District Council to Dungannon and whatever they call it now, Mid-Ulster District Council. It would be like that. Maybe a slightly different rate. Maybe more Irish in the schools. But like moving from England to Scotland today under Home Rule, that would have been a very soft border. The same economic system. Still part of the empire, still a governor in Dublin for the whole island. The Union Jack still flying with a green flag in Dublin. That would have been a soft border. Come to 1920, 1922, there were attempts to force the Unionists economically into a united Ireland by Dáil Éireann, the Belfast boycott, which stopped trains, cigarettes from Gallagher's, Bushmills whiskey. The cigarettes and the whiskey were the only things were not destroyed when the trains were stopped. As they crossed the border, a limited number of businesses in Belfast, and actually turned out to be a very sectarian development, which people regretted. P.S. O'Hegarty, a Sinn Féin writer, said it created partition before there was any partition in Ireland, the Belfast boycott of 1920. But unionism controlled the commanding heights. So many industries were owned by, Harland and Wolff's, Unionist owned, Gallagher's tobacco factory, Michael Gallagher from the northwest, Thomas Gallagher rather, the big distilleries like Dunville's, the rope works, these were all owned by Ulster Protestant businessmen. But they traded with the British Empire. They sold their linen in ships to India and Canada. They wanted that free trade area, remind you of the European Economic Community. They needed to operate within that. They didn't need the South. They weren't selling ships to Cork. They weren't selling finished linen to Galway. They were selling it to Toronto and Calcutta. So their concern about a hard border, this ruling unionist business class, was much less than you might have thought. They would have thought that the South was the tail trying to wag the dog, in terms of northern unionism. And of course we end up with a situation with massive violence on both sides of the border in 1920 to 22. Shocking sectarian violence in Belfast. Cannibalism, Churchill said, except the perpetrators stopped short of devouring the flesh of the victims on both sides. Massive movements. Catholics going south from the north, particularly from Belfast. Protestants coming from as far away as West Cork, the border counties like Cavan and Leitrim, into Northern Ireland seeking security. We heard about a family in Larne. There are many more in Lisburn and everywhere else. As they fled, this kind of ethnic violence that marked partition as well. This was happening all over Europe, of course, as borders were drawn after the First World War. I suppose both parts of Ireland remained in the Empire, and that was certainly a common link. But because of the Cold War that emerged after 1922, a Southern Prime Minister never met a Northern Prime Minister until 1965, when O'Neill left Mass, and that opens a completely new chapter, you know. That's all gone. That's all for it. Have we a final question or two? Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask, in 1966, RT made a drama about the Easter Rising, and in one of the episodes, it's a school in the countryside where there's a lesson being taught, and on the blackboard is written, "We are all good little English children." And I'm just wondering, have you heard that phrase? Is it a bit of a myth?
No,
or is this what was being taught?
You know.
Yeah, but yes, the basis of the national school system was essentially that majority Gaelic speaking population would have to attend school, and obviously Irish wasn't taught in the school. So I thank the blessing and the day on which this day has smiled and made me in this Christian day as a happy English child. So all these monoglot Irish speakers who didn't have any English used to go into school, to the national school, and say this every morning. So it was a form. It was essentially, and it was transported throughout the empire. Essentially, it's a means of colonialising the mind of ordinary people and trying to break with the cultural tradition of the indigenous culture, and then to try and impose your own culture. And so the Japanese followed the national school model when they invaded Korea, and they tried to do the same thing. The thing about it was Robert Peel who introduced the national school system. The national school system, like any system, has benefits and drawbacks, and one of the big benefits was that it essentially created a literate population, and the literate population in English was one of the main reasons for the rise of Irish nationalism. And it's also very ironic that Thomas Davis and Earl Oak, who didn't really have much Irish, promoted culture and nationalism, while Daniel O'Connell, who was a native Irish speaker, attended meetings in 1843. I think there was 800,000 people at Tara, and I'd say 800,000 of them spoke Irish, and he addressed them in English because the newspapermen couldn't understand Irish. And it was that. So this is the forces of modernisation and the modern communication age, intruding really onto what was a pre-modern Irish political culture in which most people spoke Irish. It became very, very clear to a lot of people, particularly after the famine, that Irish became associated with poverty and with emigration. So I said there were 2 million people left in the 20th century, 7 million people left in the 19th century. In the last 200 years, 9 million people have left Ireland. There's 70 million people across the world who claim to have Irish descent, both Presbyterians and Catholics, all over the diaspora, spread all over the world. So the erosion really of the Irish language, it's a dual function. It's state promoted also, but it's because of the development of, about the modernisation of Irish economy and its integration really as a feeder of the British capitalist system in terms of agricultural production and workforce.
And yes, I'm not sure if you've seen any books produced by the national schools in Ireland. Remember, we had national schools from 1831 when Stanley brought them in to 1922 partition, and they remained national schools in the Free State afterwards. They were set up as non-denominational schools, but by 1840 the churches had moved in. All the teachers were paid by the state, but the state very closely controlled the curriculum. And if you look at they're beautifully produced books, maybe 300 or 400 pages, the first reading book, the fifth reading book when you got to about age 12. Beautiful line drawings of the Giant's Causeway and the hills of Kerry. Lots of poems from Thomas Moore, and all of that. No reference to history. It was seen as very subversive. They're all in English. A letter of 1850 from one of the commissioners says, while we might be nostalgic about the old language, it belongs to the past, we must move on. And so that poem you're referring to was a famous one that was true. It was, I shall be a happy English child. That was a poem that the Irish child was reciting. Probably 40% of the children who went to national schools in the 1830s were Irish speakers. This is before the catastrophe of the famine. Irish is spoken down to the late 19th century over a large part of central Tyrone, the glens of Antrim down to the 1920s. So a lot of Irish, most of Donegal then, right up to Fennet and all, was Irish speaking. So the upshot was that I was talking about this to a group yesterday, and in the group was a lady from Wales, and she said to me, actually, she said, in Welsh schools, and Wales has survived very well as a language, she said there was a movement in the equivalent system of schools brought in 1870 in Wales, which attempted to suppress the Welsh language, and children were punished for speaking Welsh in the valleys of North Wales, and that for a period. In Ireland, certainly, children were punished for speaking Irish in school. There were all sorts of mark were being made in a rod, they were slapped, they were beaten, and so on. The national schools, two things played a key role in the decline of the Irish language. One was the national schools, which brought in an Anglophone society. The second thing was Maynooth, the establishment of the Royal College of St. Patrick in Maynooth for the training of Catholic priests, set up by the British government in 1795 because they thought that the Catholic colleges of the continent were too influenced by the French Revolution. And priests went in, clerical students went into Maynooth from Clare and Kerry and Donegal, native Irish speakers, and emerged preaching in English to Irish-speaking congregations, and Irish became a badge of poverty in the eyes of many people. And to their credit, it was the Presbyterians of the North in the 1790s and in the 1840s who actually tried to preserve the Irish language. The first magazine was published by the Presbyterians in Belfast in 1792. The Harp Festival preserved the music of ancient Ireland. Again, the Presbyterian United Irishmen. And in the 1840s, they set up the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language, and a key figure was a man called Robert Shipboy McAdam, who's remembered today in the name of the Culture Land in Belfast. And he owned the Soho Foundry in the Shankle Road and spent his lifetime translating texts into Irish and producing a dictionary. So you can't separate the Presbyterians from attempts by others to lose the Irish language, but that comes back to what you're asking.
Okay, I think just about wraps up the evening. Just like to say thank you to our panel. I think they're a very comprehensive, very interesting discussions, and I'd like to thank them on behalf of Mid-Ulster.